Ooh, suddenly soundtracks are here to provide you. Suddenly soundtracks will show you care. Oh, be more the soundtrack inside you with sweet understanding. Oh, with sweet understanding. With sweet understanding. Soundtracks are your friend. Hey guys, welcome to Suddenly Soundtracks, the show where we judge a movie solely based on the soundtrack that it provides. It is back after 2 whole years of hiatus right here on the PJ Campbell Network. If you guys are not familiar with how Suddenly Soundtracks works, it is very simple. Myself and my guest, or 2 or 3, or however many, go through a soundtrack, track by track, judging it not by the movie itself, but by the soundtrack that it provides, as I said at the top of the show. The rating system is pretty simple. You go from the best rating, which would be a rockin', which is the best of the soundtrack, the best of the best. There's the downloaded option, which is it's a good song, but it's not in the upper echelon. One-time listen basically means it's okay. And then you have the bottom tier option, which is you don't like the song and you would skip it. At the end of the show, I go through what everybody scored each song, and we make a final assessment on what the verdict is. And without further ado, I am here with the one and only. You guys know him from the Schmodown. You might know him from the critically acclaimed network. 2 of my very dear friends. Here is William the Beast Bibbiani.
Hello, everybody. Growl, growl.
And Whitney Seibold.
Social distancing. Whitney.
Did someone say my name? Hi, here I am. We're keeping 6 feet apart, but because of technological limitations, we're in front of the same camera. So hands off of everything, and we're keeping our distance to be responsible.
Excuse me for a second, Whitney.
Oh, excuse me. Okay. So here I am again. Dash handsome in my brand new fish shirt. All the hot young models in France are wearing koi these days. But it's good to be here. Thank you. The Rocky Horror Picture Show is very dear to me. I started going when I was in high school. Over the course of high school and college, I probably saw it about 100 times in the theater. And then thereafter, I got a job working at the movie theater that showed it. So I projected another several thousand times again over the course of the next 13 years or so.
That's not an exaggeration.
That's not an exaggeration at all. This is a film that is kind of in my blood at this point. So I have plenty I can say about it. Or maybe I can't. Maybe it's too deeply part of me. We're about to find out. William, do you have something to say?
I do. I also like the film.
Beautiful.
So let's get started.
Yay!
In all seriousness, Bibbs, how did you first see the film, or what are your initial thoughts of Rocky Horror when you think about it?
Well, Rocky Horror, there's 2 ways to experience Rocky Horror. There's experiencing it with a live crowd, with a lot of interactivity, people playing dress up, and then there's watching it at home or in an otherwise non-interactive environment. And that was my first experience with Rocky Horror. I remember the first time it was released on DVD.
Okay.
I had picked it up. I'd never had a chance to see it in a theater, and I watched it without any sort of commentary track. And guess what? I thought it was great. Some people say that there's only one way to watch Rocky Horror, and that's with a crowd. I think that's crap. I think Rocky Horror is actually a legitimately really good movie on its own terms. Yeah, it's cheesy in some respects, but it knows exactly what it's doing. I admire the way that it takes outsider art and other various subcultures from the 70s, puts them front and center and makes them heroic and makes them villainous and makes them something to aspire to. I really think that's something that that gets lost when we talk about the conversation of the movies that inspired Rocky Horror. The sci-fi and horror films of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, some of them hold up great. The ones that don't sometimes get overlooked or sort of tossed aside in the bad pile. And I think that's crap. I think there's a lot to love about that cinema, and I think Rocky Horror keys into a lot of the themes and subtexts and otherwise wonderful things about those movies, even the not particularly good ones, that deserve to live on. And as a result, I am a big supporter of Rocky Horror carrying the torch for that kind of cinema. And on top of it all, the songs kick butts. I'm really excited about this podcast. Whitney.
Having seen the film a lot, I can say that it actually is not that great a movie.
You lie!
Well, I also had the experience of one time I watched it on home video without the sort of live cast, without any sort of callbacks. And good golly, it's a slow movie. It's actually a little dull. In terms of just its pacing, there are long spans of silence that kind of need to be filled by audiences screaming. I think it's really conducive to audience participation because of those big blocks of silence, because there's plenty of you to enact and shout out during those periods. I think it was very daring at the time. I think studios and many audiences didn't know what the hell to do with this bizarre space alien drag queer musical film. It went to the midnight circuit pretty early on in its life, and for the better part of 20 years was one of the most important chunks of queer subculture in the big cities where it played on the regular. Over the years, when, being queer was no longer seen as at all subversive, it kind of lost a lot of its teeth. It went really mainstream, and before you know it, Glee is doing an episode themed around it. I think the culture that surrounded it also started to skew a lot younger. I saw this happen as I was working the midnight shows at Rocky Horror. It used to be like sort of college kids and guys in their 20s, and a lot of punk rockers, metalheads, a lot of outsiders, and over the years started to creep back into high school until the mean age of the kids going was around 15 or 16, which means it couldn't be quite as dangerous. They took a lot of the edge off. It's still a lot of fun. I still think it's something everybody ought to do at least twice in their life, but it doesn't carry the same sort of teeth or lips, as it were, as it once did.
Let me talk.
William?
Hi. What he said, if we're being frank, what is daring for one generation is almost always a little passé within at least two more generations. That's a lot of that is as it should be. We want to become more progressive. We want to become more inclusive. We want people who feel like outsiders not to have to feel isolated and alone. There's an element of cool that sometimes gets lost in that transition, but it's better that people in the queer community are more accepted now than they were when Rocky Horror came out. And we do have Rocky Horror at least a little bit to thank for increasing a level of awareness and acceptance of various forms of human sexuality and kink and just cosplay. So, again, I think it's an important film. It's worth remembering that although it was not a hit when it came out, the fact that it never left theaters meant that it has been steadily accruing money, and it actually is on lists of the most profitable movies ever made now. So never trust anyone who tells you just when a movie comes out that it's not a hit, it's not popular, it didn't make money. The history is long, and history has a tendency to rediscover things. So, yeah, I love Rocky Horror. Whitney loves Rocky Horror. Let's talk Rocky Horror.
Yeah, and the biggest difference about this is that we're not actually judging Rocky Horror based on the movie. The movie itself, in my opinion, also, I'm actually in the boat with both of you kind of combined. The movie by itself is really good, and I think by itself, I think the first part of the movie is phenomenal.
Yeah, especially the first act or so. Yeah.
Yeah. After I'm gonna say this, I think after Meatloaf dies is where it starts to get really weird.
It also loses a lot of energy after Meatloaf dies. The songs get a little less peppy.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that.
That's fair.
And but I feel like the first part of the movie definitely amplifies on audience participation, and the last part of the movie stands by itself as a film without the audience participation because of the dead spots. Although that it makes it a weaker part of the movie, I think it stands by itself better than the first part, which you need that audience atmosphere, I think. Now let's get right into this with science fiction double feature.
Michael Rennie was ill the day the earth stood still, but he told us where we stand.
I think that this is, for me, the quintessential song from the Rocky Horror soundtrack. It is not particularly keyed into the plot, but it sets us up for everything we are about to see. It establishes the film within a framework of previous cinema. It establishes that we love old sci-fi movies, many of them cheesy. We care about the people who made them. We care about the stories. We care about the subtext. And the fact that it is told with bright red, luscious lips, just going right at the audience, as big as your head, is reminding us that there's an intimacy not just to these films, but also to the theatrical experience, and also to the subtext of these films is often very sexual. Talk about Anne Francis in Forbidden Planet. That is a story of sexual awakening. I love this song. I think it's beautiful. I love its peaks and crescendos. I love its little quiet moments, and I love that it is one of the geekiest movie songs of all time. If you're a movie lover, I would be very surprised if you don't love science fiction double feature. Whitney?
Science fiction double feature was a little bit of a curiosity with the Rocky Horror cast because a lot of the kids who would strip to it or sing along to it or give it its callbacks didn't know any of the references in it. Like they didn't know who Anne Francis was. They didn't know what a Triffid was. They didn't know who Leo G. Carroll was. There's
Tarantula.
they hadn't seen the movie Tarantula, and in fact, the people who ran the cast every couple of years or so had to give assignments to the cast members. You have to go out and you have to watch Day of the Triffids. You have to go out and watch Forbidden Planet. You have to watch The Day the Earth Stood Still. You have to watch anything by RKO, which is referenced very heavily in Rocky Horror on camera there during the floor show sequence. The curtain opens and Frankenfurter is standing right there amidst the RKO logo. This film is both a tribute to, you can tell through the lyrics of this song, it's a tribute to those old science fiction movies, but it doesn't feel at all like that. This is the queer version of it. This is the punk rock version of it. This is the underground version of these science fiction movies. This
Whitney,
is
let me interject
the very,
for 1 second.
very modern. Let me finish my sentence. Very modern version of this movie. Willie wants to interject.
I will give the floor back to Whitney in just 1 second. I believe what Whitney is trying to say in the modern parlance is that Rocky Horror Picture Show says the quiet part loud. All of the subtext in these movies is now the text, and everything else that was supposed to be there to keep you distracted and maybe deliver that subtext, stuff like plot and character. We're not about that anymore. We're here for the kink. Whitney.
Yeah, the coded queer characters are now just queer characters. That's it.
Yeah.
It's like there's a long tradition. They'd cast somebody like Peter Lorre, and they'd direct him to be sort of really femmy in some sort of way, or James Whale's the old Dark House. James Whale is a gay man, and he put a lot of queer subtext into his movies.
You think?
Yeah, a little bit there. You squint and you might see it. This rainbow that's blinding you. Richard O'Brien was, of course, very interested in exploring that. There's a really wonderful... We'll get to it later when we're talking about Sweet Transvestite, but there's a really wonderful reference to Steve Reeves and how a lot of these old classic monster movies were essentially gay porn for the time. A lot of gay men would rally around these sort of bodybuilder movies because it was just a lot of beefcake on display, a lot of greasy, shirtless dudes. And that was like the most erotic thing you could find back when it was still illegal to be gay in public.
Yeah, in the mainstream at least.
In the mainstream. So this is still sort of a cult oddity, but it's definitely mainstream now. So Rocky Horror has completed its evolution.
Talk about what I already talked about. Oh, sorry. Hi. I already talked about it musically. I don't think Whitney's really talked about the music. He's talked about the history and the lyrics. I'm curious what you think about it musically.
Science fiction double feature is a beautiful lullaby. It's actually not a really good declarative statement for something like Rocky Horror, which is a little bit more raucous in spirit overall. But it's just a really great lullaby about the movies, and I call it a lullaby because I sang it to my son when he was a baby.
That is on brand.
This is it's one of those things where you've just had an infant child and you're holding your infant child and you're not getting any sleep, and like every single song just empties out of your head. And for I couldn't think of Rockabye Baby or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Those things somehow didn't manifest in my brain. The only things I could think to sing to him were like old chewing gum jingles from commercials I remember from being a child, and Late Night Double Feature. That song was somehow still in the forefront of my brain. So I think it's a very lovely song. I think it's completely gentle and obscure, but also very loving.
I take issue with one thing Whitney said. Whitney argued that it maybe isn't the best, like, sort of powerful intro, a statement of purpose for Rocky Horror. I actually disagree. I think that lullaby quality is inviting the audience into two states. One is a very dreamlike state in which we're going to accept what we see and not maybe question its bizarreness. But I also think that it sets us up later for the end of the film. Which is very sad. There's a lot of melancholy, and of course Frankenfurter's classic line that he sings in a later song is "Don't dream it, be it." I think this song is equating motion pictures to dreams. I think it is equating the genre of science fiction to something we can personally connect to, and that's why it isn't a huge power ballad. That's why it is a lullaby. I think it is reminding us that we have a connection to this kind of cinema. So I actually think this is the best song in the soundtrack. I think it peaks a little early, but I also love the rest of the soundtrack, so I can't wait to talk about the rest.
Wonderful. So what we're going to go into now is what we actually score the bugger. The thing is with science fiction double feature, you guys actually nailed it. You open up it's a lullaby. And it's really you don't see that often with musicals, especially rock musicals. Like this is supposed to be with a lullaby or a soft rock anthem kind of thing. I love the reference, especially to my favorite film, King Kong. I think King Kong itself has a big thematic kind of presence throughout the entire film. But for me, science fiction double feature, probably I'm going to give a Rockin', because you have to judge a soundtrack and a movie by the opening number. If the opening number doesn't grasp you, that's not a good sign, and I think science fiction double feature does that. Bibbs, you said this was your favorite song on the record, so
yeah, it's rockin'. I'm going to tell you this right now. It is rockin'. Whitney, gauge this song.
Well, let's see. On a scale of rockin', it's rockin'. Yeah, this is a really, really wonderful song. I've sung it karaoke style back when that was actually kind of gauche. But I did it anyway. I do really love the lyrics. I do love its sort of hypnotic quality, and I think it's gentle, it's a little sexy, it's a little seductive. I feel like I stand by my statement. I think like if you're really trying to get us into the very spirit of Rocky Horror, seeing it live with a bunch of really rowdy kids singing along to it, and along with the Trixie character who strips to it, kind of gets you in the spirit a little better than the song itself. But that doesn't change the fact that the song is actually really great just on its own. And you could just hear it on the radio and have this wonderful little 70s rock ballad in your ear for the rest of the day.
And if you guys ever listen to the Broadway versions of it or the stage versions, they actually rock it up. So...
Well, I'm not sure if that was the original. It's been a while since I heard the actual Broadway soundtrack.
The original Roxy version does rock it up a little bit more than than the actual movie does. But a lot of it, that all has to deal with a live audience and a band. You naturally just, when you're with a band, pick up the pace a little bit in the drums. But yeah, we're going to go to the number 2 song, which this one is a fan favorite of a lot of people. It's the duet, Damn It, Janet.
I've one thing to say, and that's damn it, Janet, I love you.
Damn It, Janet is... Well, I mean, it's a comedy song. It's a love song, of course. It's about, Brad, played by Barry Bostwick in the movie, declaring his love for Janet, played by Susan Sarandon. And about how they've just left a wedding. He says, "Hey, Janet, I've got something to say. I really love the skillful way you beat the other girls." Say,
to the bride's bouquet.
Say, with whips and chains.
With whips and chains.
To the bride's bouquet. Oh, you don't know the callbacks? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the callbacks the way you do.
Yeah, you beat the other girls with whips and chains to the bride's bouquet. It's corny, but of course it's meant to be really corny. But here's the thing about just about all of the songs in the Rocky Horror soundtrack. Good God, it's catchy. It just it sticks in your head, and each one of the songs, like the really high energy numbers, have this.
Yeah.
Like that's in it. Here's the ring to prove that I'm no joker. It's all in there. And that kind of 1950s doo-wop beat is underneath most of the tracks in this, and that kind of is one of the secrets to creating an earworm. And I think Richard O'Brien knew that. So when he's putting together his songs, he's putting something that feels really like an innocent 50s one-hit wonder, essentially. And you could compare something like this to That Thing You Do, essentially.
Yeah.
This sort of fake 50s song that actually feels like a real 50s song. William?
May I?
Yeah.
I have a cat. Okay, so I also love this song, and I think after that... 1 second. There we go. Okay. I also love this song. I think it's a great counterpoint to that lullaby opening. We talked about how it's not really a banger to get us started, but we need something really, really fun right afterwards. It's a great counterpoint. It is a kitschy, silly love song, and one of the things I love about that is that, again, Rocky Horror is about a lot of... it's about sexual identity that goes beyond the milquetoast 1950s Americana. So when we represent the milquetoast 1950s Americana, it is presented as something kind of dumb. Like, it's superficial, it's dumb. We don't really get a sense that Brad and Janet actually have a deep, meaningful connection or that they've ever really talked about anything significant in their lives. I mean, there's a lyric in the song where they talk about how, oh, now that we're getting married, there's only one thing to do. Talk to our old science teacher.
Go to the man who began it.
Janet. That's not great love. That's not a great love story. It's fun and it's catchy, and bless Richard O'Brien. The guy knows a good rhyme. Like, Richard O'Brien, if you study Richard O'Brien's lyrics for Rocky Horror, Shock Treatment, his solo work, he weaves great lyrics in a way that I think few other people can. Damn It, Janet is just such a simple, effective rhyme that I think we sometimes forget how brilliant it is, because it's funny. It is, you can use it a whole bunch of different ways within the song, and he uses all of them. Richard O'Brien wrote my favorite musical lyric ever, and it's from a song called Ain't That to Die For. He wrote, the quick of us pick Icarus to be a stinker of a pilot, but anyone that near that sun ain't no shrinking violet. Boy, is that a great lyric. Are you kidding me? You sang that, and it was catchy. So I think Damn It, Janet is fun, cute. I think it gets everyone on board that this is going to be a fun experience, and also reminds us that this is also going to be pretty stupid. So enjoy.
Mm-hmm. It's a tone setter. It's catchy. It's essentially Crocodile Rock. Essentially, yeah.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah,
which is also kind of a dumb song, but it's so great.
Yeah, it's that kind of earworm as you guys were talking about, and the fact of the matter is, you can listen to that by itself, and it would be perfect for radio. I don't know if you could say "damn it" on the radio, but I mean, it's a perfect radio.
I think you can now. I don't think you used to be able to. Yeah.
Yeah, but for what I'm gonna say, I'm gonna just say right now, "Damn It, Janet's easily rocking. It's phenomenal. It's catchy, and that's what you have to do. As long as you remember a song from a soundtrack, that's the whole point. It's amazing, and it's catchy. Bibbs, what do you give it?
Oh, it's definitely rocking. It's iconic for a reason. It's funny. It's got a tune. You can dance to it. It's paced in such a way that it invites audience participation. Whitney talked about how the movie is kind of slowly paced. I think that's a bit deliberate because the movies that the movie is inspired by are kind of slowly paced. But I think in the case of Damn It, Janet, it finds the perfect balance where it just leaves just the right gaps. For if you're not going to yell at the screen, at least you're thinking to yourself, this is dumb. And it is dumb, and you should be thinking that, and you should be loving the hell out of it. Whitney?
No, it's all been said. Additionally, however, I think Barry Bostwick, who is a grievously underrated performer.
Agreed.
He is really, really funny. Really sells the part of Brad incredibly well, especially through this song. Is this sort of like, gee shucks, kind of ultra square dipwad.
But he also knows that his look is kind of based on Buddy Holly, so he gets some of those cool dance moves.
A little bit, but
just a little bit. He just throws in a little white rock.
Let's go to the man who began it.
Janet.
Yeah, meaning everyone in the audience is screaming, let's go screw the man in the casket. It's... it's an easy song to make disgusting because I think it's a little bit disgusted with itself, and I love that. I love that about it. I give it a rockin', yeah.
Yeah, that's easy. All right, so we're gonna go to the next one, which I personally find when I talk to people who love the soundtrack, this is many of their favorites. It's Over at the Frankenstein Place, and this is the part of the movie where you actually get introduced to the main set piece of the entire film, which is the mansion.
Outside of the context of the movie, Over at the Frankenstein Place does have this great kind of... we were talking about how Damn It, Janet was sort of this really cheesy 1950s. This one is a good old 1970s rock ballad with, it starts kind of really slow. It has this long, pulsing rhythmic bass that leads us into the song, and it starts really quiet. And then it builds to a really big sort of chorus, even bigger than science fiction double feature. And it does evoke a lot about what we were going to expect from this big place. In the context of the film, however, it is an awkwardly long song that doesn't really contribute to sort of the plot or move anything forward in any kind of significant way. It feels completely inorganic in terms of the cinema. In a stage show, I think it's really needed because you can't build the castle on stage, but in film... They have a model. They have a house they can actually film. They have a big flag and the lightning. So to have this big sort of introduction where these two characters are wandering off of the street after we've already had a long scene establishing exactly what they're doing and where they're going, it brings everything kind of to a dead halt. That said, I do like the song. I do think it builds really well. I like the solo that Richard O'Brien has in the middle of it. The flow, Morpheus, slow. I love his weird, reedy voice.
Into my life.
Yeah, that's the one. But why are Brad and Janet singing about how there's a light when they already saw it and they're already approaching the house? Context of a story, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Anyway, William.
Okay. Whitney's very smart.
Oh, thank you.
Everything he said is true about it in the context of the film. Yeah, you could totally just cut to Brad and Janet sing the Frankenstein Place, and then them knocking on the door, and Richard Bryan saying, "Yo, what?" Like, that would be fine. But I do like it, even though it does kill the pacing. I think it's a sacrifice to the music gods, because we made this great song. And it's a wonderful song. It got a big build. It sticks with you, I think, in a way that actually sort of supersedes how little it has to do with anything. I think it sets up the Frankenstein Place. It doesn't make any sense that Brad and Janet know it's called the Frankenstein Place, but what are you going to do?
They don't sing it. The chorus.
Well, I suppose that's true, but they are singing the song. When are they waiting? Are they just leaving out the chorus and not hearing anyone say that? In the context of the movie, it doesn't really work. In the context of the soundtrack, which is all that matters here on Suddenly Soundtracks. I think if you're just listening to the soundtrack, and there's sometimes that's what people do. You hear a soundtrack to something before you see it. A lot of people heard the soundtrack to Hamilton before they could get tickets to Hamilton. That's
And still haven't.
You still can't get tickets to Hamilton.
right. Well, now you really can't. But Hamilton still works because you can hear the whole story on that soundtrack. And Rocky Horror doesn't quite work that way. But I think when you're listening to the soundtrack, it is a song of transition. And I think it transitions you into the rest of the narrative. And I think it really, really works as a soundtrack song. So I'm a big fan, but Whitney is right about the criticisms within the film.
Oh yeah, if this was judged by the film on top of the soundtrack, Frankenstein Place would probably get a lower rating from me personally. As much as a good song it is, and how great the beat is, and the whole transition process as you were talking about, I love the bass line. I really love the bass line, and I think Susan Sarandon's vocals are actually really underappreciated as well. She really kind of nails the sweetness of Janet. But I would say it was going to be a one-time listen ranking if it was going to be based on the movie. But it's too good of a song to give it that, so I would recommend to download it. That would be my rating for this. Bibbs, while you're on screen, what is your rating?
It would be very easy to give most of the songs in the soundtrack a rockin'. But if you do that for all the songs, it starts to kind of lose all meaning. So this one, I'm going to downgrade it to a download it. It's a really lovely song. You're going to listen to it over and over and over again. But maybe it's a little superfluous. Whitney?
I concur. This is a download in terms of, especially when going up against a lot of the other powerhouses we're about to have on this soundtrack.
Yeah.
I feel like if you're listening to this just sort of as a soundtrack record and you're trying to construct a narrative, it might be a little bit helpful to understand that they're looking for a light. It feels too big of a song in sort of the context of the story. You would think that they had been lost for a very long time, several days in the woods before they found the light. But they could have put that in the movie. Why not? But I feel like in terms of establishing what the Frankenstein Place is, well, we're about to get to two of the most notable songs on the soundtrack, one right after the other. So,
and then I think another one right after that, and then another one.
Oh, and then one right after that. It's
up until like halfway points.
There's not a whole lot that aren't.
The first half of Rocky Horror is pretty impeccable.
Yeah.
Right now, we're going to be going to, as you said, probably the most, not probably, it is the most famous song from Rocky Horror, and it's the Time Warp.
It's astounding. Time is fleeting. Madness takes its toll.
Which one was this? This was it's the dance one, right?
Whitney, shut the hell up.
Sarcasm. I'm just.
If you've been to a fifth grade Halloween party, you know the Time Warp.
Yeah, you can get what are they called? Like, not Famous Amos, Famous Eddies, like whatever those like generic public domain rockin' party CDs you get down at Party City.
Yeah, for Halloween.
For Halloween. This is on every single Halloween mix, right next to Ghostbusters and the Monster Mash. It is just really entrenched itself in Halloween culture, which is weird because there's nothing particularly Halloween-y about it. The Time Warp sounds like a science fiction-y sort of thing, not like a monster movie sort of thing. The fact that time warping has absolutely nothing to do with the dance or the song or the tone of the song at all is completely irrelevant because it's just so brassy. This is like if Ethel Merman were a brass section, it would sound like this. It was really wonderful. You want to do the dance, that they stop the dance and teach you how to do it partway through. Just like they did in a lot, like the Monster. Well, I guess they don't teach you how to do the Monster Mash in the Monster Mash.
Let me jump in here. I'm a firm believer that any song that is trying to popularize a dance has to teach you how to do the dance within the song. And as a result, no song is better than the Time Warp. Because Time Warp literally stops to teach you the dance. And the dance is very simple. The dance is something that just about everybody can do, at least some variation on. The song is catchy as hell. I disagree that the Time Warp has nothing to do with anything. I think the phrase Time Warp actually represents the fact that Brad and Janet have now entered into another world. And there may be a time warp where all of a sudden these kids who are obviously in or in a culture directly inspired by the 1950s have been pushed ahead into the 1970s at least, and as a result...
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, it's figurative, it's not literal, but I like that element. I feel that the Time Warp is one of those songs that it is easy to overlook because it is so popular. And it's something that we tend to discuss in music criticism. I don't think the best music critics do it, but I've heard people talk about music this way in that, yeah, it's a good song, but it's so overplayed. That doesn't stop it from being a good song. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast, Chris, or no? I am?
Go for it.
Okay, let's just be honest with ourselves here. All Star by Smash Mouth fucks.
It's awesome.
That's a great song. It was wildly overplayed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it showed up in every single movie and became a bit of a cliche to the extent that when you saw it, you didn't necessarily want to hang out with it anymore. But that doesn't mean it's not a great song. All Star is a wonderful, chipper song, and I feel the same way about the Time Warp. It's as catchy as any song in any musical ever. And I think it does a really good job of getting the audience, or the listener in the case of the soundtrack, on board with everyone here at the Frankenstein place. You think this is going to be a great place. And of course, they're going to subvert that. So I think it does its job as a bit of storytelling, but I also think that it is just one of the damn catchiest songs ever made. Whitney.
To expand on William's point, he actually has a good point there. If we're to take Rocky Horror as a satire of like Ozzie and Harriet and 1950s wholesomeness, then I guess you could take the Time Warp as another step of parody. It has this sort of bold, brassy, like 1970s rock sound to it, but that they're teaching you how to do a dance step is such a retro thing. That's not something you would hear about in the night. Like David Bowie wouldn't sing a song like that.
Maybe in his first album.
Maybe in his first album, and he would do it kind of ironically in a sort of like a fun, folksy sort of way. You wouldn't hear like throw your arm in the air and shake your leg. Like that's yeah.
Because there's a star. Like, you're just not gonna.
I guess if you do call it the Time Warp, they're sort of saying that the 50s are a little bit jumbled in this universe, and they are. If I do have any complaints about this song, it's that I think the Broadway version is better.
Totally.
The film soundtrack has vocals by Richard O'Brien, who has a really great rock vocal when he gets to the actual singing, like when he has that sort of scream to it. I remember! That part's really cool.
So great.
But the intro, where he just sort of growls, I love it. But I've heard people actually sing that portion, and it's a little bit better. And then we cut to Pat Quinn, who she's admitted herself cannot sing. She just sort of...
She's being hard on herself.
She can sing okay, but she's really just sort of speaking those lyrics. And I think if you had two people with like stronger vocals singing those parts together like they do in the Broadway show, then it would perhaps read a little bit better. It'd be just a little bit more powerful. It would just have a lot more energy to it. That's not to say I dislike what Richard O'Brien did. I love Richard O'Brien's vocals. I think it's kind of spooky and makes it a little weird. And when you watch it on screen, he's doing things like dusting skeletons, and we actually get to see Brad and Majors, Brad and Janet kind of pass out because everything's a little bit too outrageous for them. I think that sort of power is needed when you're doing the song just by itself. Anyway, William?
No, you're good.
All right.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's all good. Okay, guys.
Well, it's a rockin'. You probably have it already. And if you don't, buy Elvira's Greatest Hits from 1998.
It's easily a rockin'. I think it's going to be universally rockin' for this one. Time Warp is one of those, like, it doesn't have to make sense. In the movie, I never thought it needed to make sense. It's not like over at the Frankenstein place where you could have gotten to point A to point B and you could have done without it. With that, it's kind of the introduction to the world itself. It doesn't have to necessarily be, they're in a time warp of going back in time or whatever. It's just an introduction to the transvestians, to Riff Raff, to Magenta. It establishes who these people are, and Columbia and the tap dancing. that was phenomenal. So I'd have to say that Time Warp is easily a rockin'. It's a rockin' for you, Whitney. Bibbs, is it a rockin'?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's rocking.
No shit. We're gonna go to the this one is probably up there with the most famous tracks.
Just a sweet transvestite.
Okay, this isn't just Tim Curry's introduction to the movie. This is Tim Curry's introduction to, for the most part, the world. And I just want to say, and I stand by this, and I know some people say, oh, Rocky Horror isn't that good a movie. And there's an argument. I disagree, but there's an argument for that. Find me a better introduction to any actor. Anyone ever. He is perfectly cast in a truly, instantly iconic character, bold in everything from costume to performance to his musical voice. He's a beautiful singer. And the song is funny. It is kinky. I think whatever your sexuality, when you see Tim Curry perform Sweet Transvestite for the first time, you go, man, maybe. Like, maybe, yeah.
I'd go there.
Yeah, let's make this one work. Like, he's incredible.
I'm afraid so, William. Which isn't nice.
Well, I suppose. Anyway, I actually think Sweet Transvestite, and we're going to get to some songs that aren't as good here. We just are. But I think Sweet Transvestite is just about perfection. I think it is funny, catchy, kinky, serves the story perfectly, tells you everything you need to know about Frankenfurter. And it's a perfect introduction to Tim Curry. In the movie, it's perfect, and I think in the soundtrack, it's just as damn good. It's just one of the great movie songs, period. Whitney.
Yeah, in the original Broadway production, Sweet Transvestite preceded the Time Warp. That was a mistake.
Huge mistake!
Because what we have so far, we had, introduce us to the fact that this is going to be an old science fiction movie. There's going to be some playful send-ups of 1950s culture, but there's still a little bit of 70s rock elements. Then we have a big dance number. Things are going to be really fun. It's not gay yet. With Sweet Transvestite, it's fucking gay. It's what's the Patton Oswalt? It's as gay as 8 guys blowing 9 guys. It's phenomenal. Good God, it's phenomenally gay. It is wonderful. Tim Curry steps out as this gigantic frothing rod of gay testosterone, spraying all over the screen. Oh my God, is it something to witness? There have been young gay men who have come of age to this song.
Over the course of this song.
Over the course of this, it's like, oh, I guess I'm gay now. It is so fucking amazing, Sweet Transvestite. It's hard for you. I've heard other people cover it, and it's impossible to outstrip what Tim Curry did. You're talking about, what's a good introduction to an actor? I don't know, Harry Lime? That's the only other one I can think of.
We already knew Orson Welles. I'm talking about Tim Curry.
Oh, it's true, an introduction.
As a character, there's... Okay, listen. As an introduction to a character, yeah, there's a few other, at least comparable, maybe arguably better character introductions out there in the world. Harry Lime from The Third Man is a great example. Introduction to an actor?
Yeah,
I can't think of a better one. They're good ones, but I can't think of anything better. And Whitney is right. This song is just an anthem. And of course, it gave us one of the best line deliveries in motion picture history, in which I see you quiver with anticipation.
Gay! Sorry. Patient. It's as good as shaving a haircut. It really is. This is something really fun. Just a little insider baseball. When we first, I worked at the New Art Theater where this showed on a weekly basis. It was one of the only theaters in the country that still did it on a weekly basis, and still
always
does,
had.
and always had, and still does. Well, not now, but did until the closures. But when they decided to buy a digital projector, it turns out we had to get a digital Rocky Horror, and it looked and sounded a little bit different. They actually used alternate vocal tracks, which was a little weird. Yeah, like ones you hadn't heard before made it into the digital truck.
What?
Not for this song, but for like throughout the movie.
I never heard that before. That's so odd.
And one of my managers, a rather impish fellow named Andy, figured out that he could actually program into the digital projector preset pauses. He was able to freeze frame the movie and then have it start up at whatever time code he selected. So when he discovered this in the theater, when Frankenfurter said, "I see you shiver with anticipation," he put in a 3-minute pause. Now, later on, he learned that 3 minutes was way too long. It was just bedlam by the end of it. He ended up, shortening it to about 15 seconds, which is just as good. I see you should have anticipated. And everyone says, say it! The fuck? It's just great.
Patient!
Thank you. This is really a wonderful send-up of a lot of old queer-coded characters. Here comes a queer-coded character who's just queer. He's a transvestite. He's wearing ladies' clothing. He's singing about how much he loves to wear ladies' clothing. He's clearly a bottomless hedonist right from the start. And he makes a lot of direct queer references. Like he says, we can take in an old Steve Reeves movie. It's like he's inviting them to watch, ostensibly, which was what was in the 1950s, gay porn. And I think it's so unbelievably queer that the squares from the 50s don't get it. Here's William.
Yeah, if you've never actually seen a Steve Reeves movie from the 1950s, and they were specifically talking about the Hercules films, first off, studly men everywhere. Just every scene. There's a joke in MST3K about how the men wear shorter skirts than the women, and that's by design. But there's also, if you watch them, the plots are all about how women get in the way of men stuff. And it's like, oh, men have to wrestle and save the day and be bros. And oh no, a woman has seduced Hercules and he's making him have sex with her. Oh, how do we stop this evil woman? How do we stop her? Because that's not what he's supposed to be doing. He's supposed to be hugging other men. It's not subtle. Everything about this song is awesome. I'm giving it the highest rockin' we can possibly give it.
Yeah. Easy. The thing is with this song, Tim Curry's vocals, I can't really go off of whatever you guys are saying because you guys basically encompass what I think of the song. It's phenomenal. It's a great introduction to the character of Frankenfurter, but on top of the soundtrack itself, it's an anthem to people, to equality, to just that entire pride, euphoria. So it's an easy rockin' for me. Whitney?
It's a rockin'.
Easy. Yeah, that's these are getting really. It's gonna get
and don't bother knocking.
Yeah, we're on the same level right now, but it's gonna differentiate soon. So we're gonna go to the song of the title character, Mr. Rocky's.
It isn't. Hold on a second. Doesn't Sword of Damocles come after I Can Make You a Man? Because it's after he makes Rocky.
Sword of Damocles is first.
It is really. Yeah. Oh, okay. My bad. I remembered it wrong.
The sword of Damocles is hanging over my head.
Sword of Damocles is sort of like Damn It, Janet, and later on Hot Patootie. It really is just another good, catchy 1950s earworm. It comes out of nowhere. It's a really great way to introduce the character. I love that Rocky Horror is played by Peter Hinwood. Whatever happened to Peter Hinwood? I don't talk about him anymore. Peter Hinwood, he appears, he's, this Steve Reeves type's bodybuilder in these little tiny gold trunks and sneakers. He's got this, really horrible looking Prince Valiant haircut, and I love that he only expresses himself through a couple songs. He sings a few solos. Peter Hinwood does not do his own vocals. I couldn't find the name of the singer who does the...
It's an uncredited vocalist.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, it's definitely not Peter Hinwood anyway. This character just sort of springs to life. He is clearly being created just to be the sexual plaything of Dr. Frankenfurter, and I love that we're introduced to the character with this feeling of complete unease about his new life. In a rock and roll sort of way. There's a version of the Rocky Horror Picture Show where Rocky Horror appears and runs away and sings sort of like a soft ballad about what is my life, I don't know what I am, I'm really sort of tortured about all of this. Richard O'Brien doesn't really care about that sort of thing. I think he wants to say, I feel like I'm under threat. I don't really know what's going on. I'm kind of sexually innocent. It's a little bit of a playful song, and he uses it through this wonderful metaphor of the sword of Damocles.
Yeah.
William?
I think it's worth noting that Sword of Damocles is a phallic image. Again, he was created for Frankenfurter's sexual needs, desires, I suppose.
Proclivities.
Yeah, whatever the hell he wants, basically. It's a fun song. I think it's a song with Whitney, I think, kind of nailed it. He talked about how it's a song about I've been created, oh no, what's my fate? But it's fun. It's got great lyrics. Again, whoever the vocalist was, if anyone knows, please let us know. Did a really, really great job with it. On the ratings for the song, Whitney, I think you need to help me out with this one.
Okay.
It's okay.
It's okay. As we say on our podcast a lot, it's fine.
I thought you were gonna do the bit.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of chastity? I think we can do better than that. I was like, what do you think of the presidential administration? I think we can do better than that. He carries the Charles Atlas seal of approval. I could recite the whole damn film, by the way. No, I really like the Sword of Damocles. A lot of people kind of poo-poo this song a little bit, in that it doesn't have, it follows Sweet Transvestite, and it is the introduction of a new character, and Rocky Horror is as striking a character as some of the others that we've seen, but for whatever reason, people aren't as attached to him as they are to some of the others.
He doesn't have let me get in here. Rocky himself, even though, of course, he's the title character, Richard O'Brien doesn't give a shit about him. Rocky is a plaything. Rocky's fate is to be a plaything. And I think in almost any other movie, any of the movies that inspired Rocky Horror, Rocky would be one of, if not the principal character. Because, what an interesting story. He was created by a mad scientist. Well, what does that mean? What does that do to you? What's your existential experience? We got one song where we pay lip service to that, but don't really get into it too hard. No, not at all. And that's fine. I think Richard O'Brien knew there needed to be something there. But he doesn't care about Rocky. He cares about Brad and Janet, these sort of stand-ins for stuck-up America, who are going to be subjected to basically outsider culture, outsider art, and be almost instantly changed by it overnight. I think that's the thing that he cares about. Rocky is merely a means to that end.
Yeah, he's a MacGuffin. Yeah, essentially. My thoughts on Sword of Damocles is, I think, in my opinion, it's kind of forgettable compared to the onslaught of the entire soundtrack up to this point, especially if you're comparing it to the previous numbers that we just witnessed.
Yeah, like the worst sin it has is that it comes after all those other songs. It's not a bad song at all. It's just, it's not as epic as the ones we just had.
It's kind of, it doesn't find its footing as a unique song, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But for Sword of Damocles itself, we can't even give it a downloaded rating because, fun fact, Sword of Damocles wasn't put on the soundtrack.
I don't understand this at all. That's so weird.
You guys said it was okay, and I'm going to give it the okay rating 2 of one-time listen. So for me, it's a one-time listen. Are you guys on board with that?
I think you can listen to it as many times as you want, but it's definitely not something, unless you're particularly fond of it. And for me, one of the reasons why I like Sword of Damocles is that it fits very tidily within my vocal range. So I will belt Sword of Damocles for that reaon.
My high is low. I'm dressed up with no place
to go. Yeah, it's great. But let's be honest here, objectively, like, it's the closest thing we have to a proper rating on the system is a one-time listen. It's good. You'll like it. It's not something you're going to like skip past or fast forward past if you're listening to the whole soundtrack, but it's not the song you're waiting for.
Well, again, if we're listening to this in the context of the soundtrack and trying to create the story of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you need Rocky's song. It's kind of valuable.
You know what? That's a good point.
Although I think it's a little odd that if on the soundtrack you don't get Rocky, but you do get Eddie's song, and Eddie, like, he's more a representative character than he is a whole character because he only exists for the span of the song. Anyway, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll get to Hot Patootie in a second here.
So that's sort of Damocles. It's probably the weakest number so far, but we're going to go into the Charles Atlas Seal of Approval. I Can Make You a Man, Part 1.
A weakling weighing 98 pounds will get sand in his face when kicked to the ground.
What are my thoughts on the Charles Atlas song? It's another one of those songs, kind of like Science Fiction Double Feature, where I had to look up a lot of the references in it. If you don't know who Charles Atlas is, you're going to be lost on this song, because it is very heavily alluding to something that was actually very popular in the 1950s, and it was Charles Atlas was a bodybuilder, and he sold essentially bodybuilding booklets in the backs of like Boy's Life magazine and other magazines and
Comics.
a lot of comic books.
Yeah.
And you're probably familiar, because you've probably seen it satirized, with the comic strips that came with Charles Atlas ads about some really skinny, nerdy guy who's on the beach with a woman, and some big, stronger guy kicks sand in his face, so he goes home and he works out and he becomes buff, and he goes back to the beach and he beats up the bully. It's a cliche now that comes from Charles Atlas ads, and what he sold was a program that he called Dynamic Tension. It's complete bullshit. And Dynamic Tension was muscle against muscle. You essentially would like grab your own fists and pull against your own strength, and you'd build up your muscles that way.
My God, the genius of it!
Yeah, I know. You don't require any kind of equipment whatsoever. You just need dynamic tension. Dynamic tension sounds pretty gay, doesn't it? And especially when Tim Curry is singing it. And he's talking about these sort of Charles Atlas ads, these old bodybuilding magazines, making the same sort of illusion that the Steve Reeves lyric did, about how he's going to make you a man in the Charles Atlas mold, which is to say, I'm going to make you into a really studly bodybuilder, and all the characters on the screen in the movie are like rubbing oil on him. It's all very erotic. Oh, William has something to say.
I think Whitney has a good point here. I think this is yet another song about how the 50s were gayer than most people realized at the time. This is about saying the quiet part loud, really loud, this thing that a lot of people just didn't question. Like, oh yeah, it's about bodybuilding. Like, no, it's about achieving the perfect male body. And we are going to take the Charles Atlas thing, which was pretty well known. Even when I was a kid, people still remember Charles Atlas. You could still like see the ads and like reprints and things. It was pretty common knowledge. Nowadays, not so much. And to take that and to just throw it in everyone's face about just how sexualizing that was about the male body, and to put it in this context is very subversive. Doesn't feel that way now, because the context is missing for a lot of people. But it's very subversive for the time. It's very playful. When it comes to the song itself, it's very catchy. Tim Curry sings it like a maniac. But I also feel like it kind of stops the movie a little bit. Like, I think we get it. He's hot. There's nothing wrong with the song. The song is very, very fun. It's just not my favorite because it feels like it's kind of just circling around the same idea over and over again, and we could pretty effectively move on now. But that's a quibble. That's a minor thing. It's just keeping it from being top shelf Rocky Horror for me. Whitney?
If you listen to the lyrics of I Could Make You a Man, there's actually nothing particularly erotic in the song itself. The song itself is actually pretty innocent if you just sort of look at the lyrics. Like, he'll do press-ups and sit-ups and swallow raw eggs. Yeah. He'll build up his shoulders, his chest, arms, and legs. You know, that's typical workout stuff. But when you hear Tim Curry sing it, and swallow raw eggs, like, it becomes really dirty all of a sudden.
Well, and you're watching him work out, like, in a very eroticized fashion.
And yeah, they bring out a pommel horse, and then Frankenfurter humps it in the movie. It's pretty astounding. I think this one hinges entirely on Tim Curry's performance of it. And I think this is a song that needs to be directed in the proper way. If you take it as just sort of a song, if you give it to some high school kid to just sort of sing straight, they may not even pick up on the fact that this is supposed to be a little bit sexualized.
A little bit?
Okay, a lot sexualized.
All right.
Yeah, and that's where it kind of, for me, is where when you're judging it based on the soundtrack, it kind of loses it.
I think the biggest problem with I Can Make You a Man is, frankly, it's the chorus. It actually has a little bit of a blaring sound to it. A lot of the other songs in this film so far have been very svelte, and they've been very sort of wordy and very rhyme-heavy. This one has this big sort of crescendo, in just 7 days, ba-ba-ba-ba. And then
I
has this...
can make you a man.
It's a falling cadence. It's a little bit too big. It slows the song down. It's actually not it's not a very graceful song. It feels a little bit too much like, well, a Jim Steinman song. And we're gonna... and that should be our perfect lead-in into our next number, unless William has something he needs to add.
Well, I think we have to rate this one, Whitney.
Okay, fine.
I'm going to give it a downloaded. I still think it's a good song, but I think you both make excellent points about how it really doesn't play that well on the soundtrack itself. It really needs the context of the film in order to really pop. But I do think it's a fun song. I think it supports the themes of the film. I do like it quite a bit. Whitney?
One-time listen. This is not one of the more popular songs in the show. It's fun because of all of the innuendo, but if you don't have somebody as charismatic as Tim Curry giving the innuendo, then the song is kind of plain and has a bad chorus.
Yeah, same. I'm going to give it a one-time listen as well. All right, guys, we're going to go into He Said Jim Steinman. We're going to get into the introduction to actually, you gave an introduction to Tim Curry in the movie industry. This is basically an introduction to Meatloaf in the movie and music industry, because this came out 2 years before Bad Out of Hell, which was his debut album. He was signed to Motown Records in 1971 with Stoney, but other than that, this is his first introduction to anything. This is Hot Patootie, Whatever Happened to Saturday Night.
You know me, Chris. I love me some Meatloaf. And this is actually, you're right, this is actually a really great introduction to Meatloaf for the world as well. And it's got everything Meatloaf would eventually become famous for. One, he's got a great singing voice. Two, he's got great stage presence, or at least, he did when he was younger and a bit more spry. And he comes in like on a motorcycle with like a Frankenstein scar, bursting through walls and sexing up everybody. It doesn't matter that he doesn't look like a conventionally attractive man. Of course, Frankenfurter would much rather all the attention be placed on Rocky. And on top of it all, the song that he is singing, much like his Steinman stuff, is extremely verbose. And I like it that way. Meatloaf comes in, you're right, for one song, and then he shows up as a corpse later, and that's enough. He makes his presence known, and this song...
Oh my God, yeah.
This song also fucks. This song is really, really, really fucking good. It's catchy, it's exciting, and it serves a really great purpose, because we see in this song, Eddie, coming out of nowhere, literally, stealing the limelight from Frankenfurter. Frankenfurter had everyone here, very specifically, to show off his new invention, the ultimate sex god. And then Eddie shows up with retro cool and distracts everybody, gets everybody turned on. And this is where the whole story changes, and the whole movie goes from being very bright and light and funny to getting darker and actually exploring some of the darker nether regions of the characters and their lifestyles. And so this is where Frankenfurter kills Eddie in front of everybody and completely changes the whole film. And the film starts losing a bit of energy from here on out. But this is a great way to go out, and I absolutely love this song.
I agree that this is sort of the turning point in the musical, and when Frank kills Eddie at the end of this song, the line of dialogue in the feature film is, Eddie's dead, and he sort of like shrugs it off. He's got the bloody gloves and just sort of chuckles and says, "One from the vaults." And, of course, that means that he had Eddie in a vault, because Eddie was literally frozen, but it was also alluding to a lot of the TV ads you'd see from like Time Life music, maybe not Time Life music specifically, but like a lot of record sets you could mail order through television, and it's like sort of the golden oldies and the classics, classic 50s rock, which, back in the 1950s was really subversive. It was something that the parents hated, but by the 1970s had essentially turned into baby boomer comfort food. It was something that was really kind of relaxing. Hot Patootie, unabashedly 1950s rock and roll. And Eddie is a 1950s greaser. He looks a lot like the Wild One. He's got, the leather jacket. And but in the 1970s, he's what you might call rough trade. No,
you're right.
Totally serious. And that's what Frank is into. He's the rough trade type. Look it up. And he comes out, he sings this wonderful 1950s song. He sings about listening to music on Saturday night. It feels like something the Beach Boys might have sung about. He even makes a reference to Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was singing his very last song. This is about sort of the last hurrah of what the 1950s could promise, and that it's coming from, like, the punker is really finally, like, the final deconstruction of the 1950s. We have this big, raucous rock and roll number from a legit rock star, and then Frankenfurter, representing modernity, murders him.
Can I make one more comment here?
Absolutely.
Because there is another reference that I think Eddie is very important. And it has to do with not just musical choices, because we're talking about a film that was a big inspiration for why films started using pre-existing pop music, but also a film that is known as one of the most important gay short films ever, and that is Scorpio Rising.
Yeah.
If you've never seen Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, it is still very powerful, and it is about bikers and the juxtaposition of biker culture with 1950s pop music, and as the short progresses, it gets more subversive and wild. I don't want to ruin it for you. I think everyone should have that experience for themselves, but it is not for everybody. It is R-rated. So just a fair warning there. That's like Rocky Horror. It's not for everybody. But I believe, and I don't actually know this for a fact, but I believe that Eddie's greaser mentality, I think that also stems a little bit, at least, from Kenneth Anger as well, and it's something that I'm sure Richard O'Brien would have been very conscious of.
In fact,
yeah. Oh, sorry.
You can see a lot of these sort of like leather jacket wearing rough trade characters also leaking in from like The Art of Tom of Finland.
Yeah.
You can see it in. If you've ever seen John Waters' film Crybaby, that's a
great movie.
1950, a film set in the 1950s, and it is about what they call the drapes, which were sort of like the bad kids, the leather-wearing ones that were grease in their hair. And John Waters, a gay man, was really...
John Waters?
Yeah, he is. He actually is. Took me a while to figure that out as well, but... Yeah, John Waters is a gay man, and he has openly admitted that that's sort of his type. That was the type he grew up seeing when he was a really young kid, like in the 1950s, and like right before he was born in the 1950s. These sorts of like bad boys, these kids who lived out on the fringe, were really appealing to him, and of course he's always wanted to live sort of out on the fringe, kind of deliberately. John Waters tells a story about how he'd steal blank report cards from his school and fill them in with all Fs just to see what that felt like.
I hadn't heard that.
He's an interesting dude, that guy. And yeah, so he was really, really drawn to this because this is sort of like the outsiders. These are the drinkers. These are the kids with switchblades. And it's also where the queer kids hung out because they were also outsiders. They couldn't really find a home. So there was a really strong undercurrent of queer culture, not just thanks to Kenneth Anger, but just thanks to culture in general. William?
Yeah, I just want to add right here that if anyone watching this hasn't seen Crybaby, when soon as this podcast is done, you go see Crybaby. Crybaby is aces. Crybaby is really, really underappreciated. I mean, it's a successful Broadway musical now, but the movie is still largely overlooked. So, yeah, really great. And this song is rocking. This is one of the highlights of the whole show, if you ask me.
Unbiased, because many people might know I'm a huge Meatloaf fan. I also run a Meatloaf. Yeah, of course. And my band covers Meatloaf, Billy Joel, and Elton John. So this song really hits home with me. Actually, this is the reason why I first got introduced to Rocky Horror. Because I realized that Meatloaf's in this movie. He did something before Bat Out of Hell. I went and that's how I discovered Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I've loved it ever since. This song will always hold. I sound very biased, but I feel like this is the superior version of Sword of Damocles on any level. I love Sword of Damocles, might be a decent song, but I think if you're comparing Sword of Damocles and Hot Patootie from the Yin and Yang, because Eddie is half brained for Rocky, so Sword of Damocles and Hot Patootie.
Is that how that works? It's half my brain is in Rocky.
Yeah.
Oh, I never had that spelled out for me.
Yeah.
That's
I think I made a mistake splitting the brain between the two of them.
yeah.
I don't remember that at all. Wow.
That's why Sword of Damocles and Hot Patootie have the same kind of layout of corporate. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's cool. I know that.
But for Hot Patootie, it's easily rocking. There's a reason why this Sweet Transvestite and Time Warp on Guitar Hero for Rocky Horror. Those are the 3 selections. It's one of the best.
Yeah.
Whitney, what do you give it?
Yeah. I got to feed the cats. I'll be right back.
All right. No, Hot Patootie is rocking. Hot Patootie is wonderful. Hot Patootie always has something to discover as well. It is such a wordy song that most of the people who have seen this movie 100 times still don't know all of the lyrics, just because Meatloaf sings them so quickly, and he makes these weird, I had to look up the lyric, I kiss her baby pink lipstick, and that's when I'd melt.
She whispered in my ear to say she really was my aunt. Sit back in front, put some hair oil. Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Yeah, my head used to swing from the perfume I'd smelt. My hands used to fumble with a big plastic belt. Like they're all of these weird things that he sort of sings so quickly and so sharply that they don't even sound like human words anymore. And
Speaking of which, cats, you're not auditioning.
the cats are meowing. They're singing about their memory. All alone in the moon. Oh, sorry.
Don't you slander my cats.
Now we're going to go into the reprise of I Can Make You a Man. This one's going to be a little bit quicker. Bibbs, what are your thoughts on the reprise of I Can Make You a Man?
It's a reprise of I Can Make You a Man.
Yeah.
It's barely its own thing. It kind of just takes you out of the song. It reminds you that Frankenfurter is the focus of everything because we just had 2 big distractions, 2 major new characters who just had, sort of Damocles is its own thing, and then Eddie got to completely steal the limelight, and that's part of the point. That's Frankenfurter taking the stage back for himself. It's necessary for the film. I actually think it works in the film as a soundtrack. It's just a quick reprise. It's a one-time listen.
Yeah, one-time listen for me too. Whitney, go for it.
Yeah, it's functional more than it is decorative or interesting. It's reestablishes Frank.
Yeah.
Which is fine and puts Rocky back. I think it's sort of getting the mood back on track. And, especially Hot Patootie is such a driving number, everybody sings and dances, then that character is rather shockingly murdered, and so we're trying to bring it back up, but that's when the irony has sort of swung in, and all of the songs after this are going to be explicitly sexual.
I was feeling done in, couldn't win.
This one is literally about fucking.
Touch it, touch it, touch it, touch me, I wanna be dirty.
Now that the reins are off, I feel like the film is trying to have a little bit more fun with it, but at the same time, we can see the downturn of the Rocky Horror Picture Show turning into something a little bit bleaker, and it actually when we finally get to the end, we'll find that it ends on a very kind of dark, depressing note. Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me is a really fun song. It's really sexy, but it's kind of hard to get wrapped up in the sexiness of it at this point in the show. Since the last song, there's actually been a lot of drama in between. There's the whole sequences where Frankenfurter has seduced Janet and then seduced Brad, and we kind of see that these characters are being, in the words of the film itself, have been sort of corrupted.
Yeah.
And so now that the characters are corrupted, let's have a little fun with it, but is it fun that Janet was corrupted? I'll leave that to William.
Yeah, this is something that I think is really interesting because on some level, what happens to Brad and Janet is the sort of thing you would see in a Hollywood scare film. You look at something like Reefer Madness, where, oh, we smoked some reefer and now we're dancing around in our underwear and we're maniacs. So I think the movie is playing off of that, the idea that what has happened to Brad and Janet is, you know, for them, troubling, disconcerting, scary, new. I think Brad is going through some serious confusion right now. But we're seeing right here is that Janet is finally willing to admit that she's into it. That she really, really, really wants to get laid. And it's something that she could never really discuss in her culture and her relationship with anybody else. And now she's in this very unique environment where it's allowed. And I actually really love this song. I love the way that it evokes a lot of the female-driven pop ballads of the 1950s, where you would hear something like, "And then he kissed me." Except this would be, you know...
I want it dirty,
but this is like the X-rated version of that. We're like, yeah, and then he kissed me. And then we're going to have sex, right? Like, this is all these chaste songs about a woman coming of age are given basically, again, the quiet part is allowed to become loud. And it becomes very, very loud. And the fact that Susan Sarandon, who has been playing very waifish until now, I mean, yeah, she's been in her underwear, but it's not really eroticized. She's not wearing sexy underwear. It feels very uncomfortable for her and Brad.
What charming underclothes you both have.
Exactly. Like, they're not wearing their underclothes presentationally. They're just under things. So seeing her all of a sudden finally, like, really just admit that she has desires of the flesh is both funny and kind of satisfying. But also, and I think this is something that the movie doesn't necessarily deal with fairly, for them it's a little sad. This is a coming-of-age story for Brad and Janet in a lot of ways, and they are giving up their innocence. You could argue that that's a good thing, and maybe it is, but it is a chapter in their lives that has been rather suddenly closed and not really when they wanted it to be. And that's a little dark, and I don't think the song necessarily deals with that. I don't even think the movie necessarily deals with that. I think the movie just sort of brushes that aside because it doesn't really care about the concerns of heterosexual repressed conservatives. That's not what the movie is about. That's fine. But yeah, the song is catchy. The song is fun. I like Susan Sarandon singing, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I think Jessica Harper is a better Janet. If you've ever seen the sequel Shock Treatment, it's not as good a movie. I would argue that the soundtrack is as good or better, and that Jessica Harper, who replaced Susan Sarandon in that film, is a better Janet. And certainly she's a better singer overall, and a part of me really wishes, as much as I love Susan Sarandon and this, as fun as this is, part of me really wishes I could have seen this movie with Jessica Harper in the role, because she's really, really great.
No, you brought up something.
We're gonna get the shock treatment eventually down.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I want to follow up something William said. It's about sort of we're not really concerned with the fall of these characters and straight white folks from small town America are essentially being destroyed before our very eyes. And I think Barry Bostwick is on the perfect note, and I think if you had somebody who was able to sort of play up Janet's sort of dull plasticity a little bit more, play the character a little bit more broad.
Jessica Harper!
Maybe like Jessica Harper, or, just another broad comedian. It would have perhaps played as a little bit more of a celebratory thing to watch these innocent squares essentially fall on their backs and spread their legs for the first time. It would seem like a little bit more of a parody. The problem is we've spent so much time with the characters, the film is so slowly paced, and Susan Sarandon and Barry Bostwick are such charming performers that we kind of like Brad and Janet a little bit, and if they're going to...
It's kind of hard not to feel for them.
Go down the road of hedonism, we would like it to be at their own behest, and not necessarily because Dr. Frankenfurter kind of pushed them into the deep end.
Well, let me actually throw that out there, because I think it's worth remembering. I think it's worth remembering, and it's so easy to forget because the songs are so fun, and the characters are so fun, and the environment around Rocky Horror is so fun. Rocky Horror is structured like a horror movie. It's an old dark house movie. A bunch of people, their car break down, they go into a weird mansion full of bizarre people, and people die.
Frankenfurter's a villain.
Frankenfurter kills somebody and then they eat on his corpse. It's not particularly malevolent as a horror movie goes, but it is malevolent. And I think that the movie has fun with that. I think the movie understands that in the films that inspired this, the films with James Whale, for example, the monsters frequently had the audience's sympathy, and that was a place for that kind of character to actually have that kind of sympathy, to actually feel for people who are outside of the norm in the mainstream. But the DNA of Rocky Horror is still horror. And I think as a result, sometimes it's easy to get distracted and actually feel for Brad and Janet in a way that I don't even think the movie wants us to.
Yeah, I also feel like, though, that judging the song by itself, Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me actually does give you, it's kind of interesting. You go from Sword of Damocles to to I Make You a Man, to Hot Patootie, to the I Make You a Man reprise, to this. I find that Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me has a lot of the same musical flares as Hot Patootie and Sword of Damocles. And there's a reason for that. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there's a deleted musical segment in Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me where Rocky begins to sing the chorus of Hot Patootie.
Oh, that is
Yeah, because that would drive home the fact that part of his brain is Eddie's.
That really would have solidified that. I don't think I would have missed that if that were in the film.
Yeah, I don't know why they decided to cut that from the film version, but it is in the Broadway. It's in the it's in the shows, so I don't know why they cut that aspect of it from the movie. But I've always loved Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me. People give crap to the Glee version, especially for the Sweet Transvestite version of Glee, which is horrendous.
Yeah.
It's an insult to the actual message of the song. But I will say that Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me is a good female vocal song just for standard, it's a good rock female song. I dig it. I wouldn't say it's among the best, but I would give it a download it. Bibbs, what do you give, what's your final?
I do think this one's rocking. I do. I have issues with, I don't necessarily think it sells itself well in the context of the film. But I think as a song, I think as a ballad of sexual awakening that is both playful and feminine and earnest, I think this one really works. I think it's a great song. I think it's a great song for, I wouldn't sing it if your school wouldn't let you do that sort of thing, but it's a great song for anyone to have in their back pocket. For karaoke or anything like that.
The seat wetting lyric is pretty gross.
The seat wetting lyric is pretty gross. You're kind of stuck with that, but that's one of the reasons why the song isn't appropriate for everything. I mean, it's literally a song about please have sex with me.
Yeah.
You can't really play that in every environment, but in an environment where it is acceptable to play that song,
like colleges.
That song's great.
Yeah.
Whitney.
Go for Whitney.
Yeah, and the lyric it ends with is Janet repeating over and over again that she is now a creature of the night. And of course, that's one of the reasons it caught on with the midnight movie circuit.
1 second.
Okay.
Creature of the night!
Well, let me lean close to the camera. Creature of the night! All right.
Creature of the night?
Creature of the night.
I'm done.
No, it's about sort of Janet's induction into the darkness, and the darkness is actually going to be the thing that ultimately wins out by the end of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So, yeah, I think out of context, this is a really fun, sexy song.
Yeah, on the soundtrack
to sing with your friends. In context of the movie, it's a little bit twisted. So yeah, I'll give it a download. It's a download.
It's not a bad song on any stretch of the imagination.
Oh goodness!
No. And then we're going to get into what I consider it's probably a lot of people forget this song exists when they do the movie. But it's Dr. Scott. We're introduced to Dr. Everett Scott, which gives the purpose of Eddie. Eddie, up until this point, he didn't mean anything. Yeah. But now he actually means something to the plot, and we're introduced to Dr. Scott, and he says a little bit about Eddie, his backstory, who he is, and how he basically got taken advantage of by Frankenfurter to be his kind of sex slave, is what I kind of got from it, that he locked him up to be his sex slave. That's essentially what I figured, and he got his brain taken away from him. Yeah. So it's a very weird predicament, and actually paints Frankenfurter in an even darker light. He's no longer this likable transvestite who likes to sing. He is an outright horrible human being.
it's really hard for me to sing Eddie without singing like the extra dirty callback lyrics. It comes at like the film is once again, because it happens a lot in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, kind of come to a halt. This new character is introduced. The intruder is entering the building, master, and you shout out, "Intruders usually do." We're introduced to this Dr. Scott character. He's not wild. He's not fun. He's here to deliver exposition to sort of shore up the fact that this is indeed a horror movie. He's sort of like the wise scientist, sort of the fatherly sage that we see in a lot of older horror movies. He fulfills a role, and I think that his song just sort of describing Eddie, it's sure a lot of fun. It's got a little bit peppy. But I feel like it's the musical trying to give itself energy right at the point when it's lagging and not necessarily succeeding all of the way.
Well, let's.
Here's William.
Well, when you look at this song in the context of the film, the dinner scene is so slow.
Yeah.
I'm actually generally not one who has a serious problem with the pacing in Rocky Horror. The dinner scene is death. The dinner scene is just drags. So yeah, they're trying to perk us up a bit. And I think that it makes sense that Eddie's dad would have a song with a similar sort of verbal cadence, very rapid fire. Little Eddie said that he did, and like his daddy, you knew he was a no-good kid. Like, that's peppy. It's fun. My issue with this song, frankly, is I don't know if anyone cares about this. I don't know if anyone else ever thought this. Who plays the scientist that we cut to who teaches us the time warp?
Charles Gray.
Charles Gray.
Gray.
Thank you.
The criminologist.
I always forget his name. Charles Gray. Charles Gray played Hans Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever. Great actor. When we cut to him, and he's a criminologist, which means he's a scientist. First time I saw Rocky Horror, I assumed that's where Brad and Janet were going, and that's why this guy knows so much, is that he was the scientist, and that when we finally saw Eddie's father, we would see it was him, and everything was going to come full circle. I think that would have been a lot stronger. I think that would have really kept the film together, because this guy who comes in the last act, basically, and he's just kind of a stick in the mud. He's got a great reveal with the stockings later, but like beyond that, it makes very little impression to me. Yeah, always felt like a missed opportunity. So listen, I like this song okay, but I don't love this song. I think it's awkward in its placement in the movie. I think it's weird to try to make us care so much about Eddie after he's already been dead for a while.
And he's not one number before that.
And he's not coming back. I mean, I get that Columbia feels something, but that was immediate. And here we're just supposed to all of a sudden, no, Eddie was really important. Well, then why did you only give him one scene? What were you thinking? So, anyway, this song has some problems. The scene has some problems. I think even the casting has some problems. But it's not a bad song. I just think it's one of the weaker ones in the film.
No, I agree. I do think it has that same sort of wonderful doo-wop flavor that all the other songs do, and it is yet another sort of 50s spoofy song. But yeah, I could do without it. If there's any one I could really do without, it's this one. Even I Can Make You a Man is, at least functional. It has a little bit of playfulness to it.
Well, you can play that one anytime.
Yeah.
This one only works in context of the film.
There you go. And it's not, like, it's a pretty energetic song when you're listening to it, but when you're watching it in the movie, they're not dancing around, they're still sitting around that fucking table singing the song, and they pull out a note, and we cut to Columbia, and she's sort of crying. It's all a bunch of still shots.
That's the problem I have with the song, too, is that it kind of, by itself, doesn't work, and in the movie, it doesn't work. I actually really like Bibbs' idea that if that was the criminologist, just for the movie purpose, it would have actually, for the movie itself, brought things together a little bit more, because why would somebody who has no attachment to these characters?
That particular thing, I do understand what they were getting at, and they were going after more of a hygiene film. Have you ever seen like a lot of the MST3K shorts? They would frequently have a voiceover, or maybe they would cut to someone at a desk just saying the human reproductive system is a one-way ticket to hell. Like that kind of thing. Like that kind of guy. So you cut to him as a voice of authority in order to give this story a sort of conservative validity. As long as this guy tells you what we're watching is not okay, it's okay that it's full of sex. So I get it, but I think it could have worked stronger in the film.
Also, I do agree that, at least for the movie purpose, they should have had a little bit more Eddie kind of establish him a little bit more.
Right.
The thing, because there's a lot of stuff I've looked into, like they were beefing up and what they cut out of the actual movie itself, and I was listening to the soundtrack. If you listen very, very closely to Time Warp, if after we're done the podcast, if you guys can listen to Time Warp and just listen very closely to when the narrator says jump to the left, and when you listen to the chorus itself, you can hear Meatloaf's vocal. He says jump to the left, and you can hear his vocal in the chorus of Time Warp.
Interesting.
So I don't know what exactly that means, but he was obviously overdubbed as the narrator, and his vocals are clear as day in the chorus on the soundtrack of Time Warp. So what I've always assumed was that his part was supposed to be bigger in the movie,
Right.
and they just cut it.
Well, the other thing
Yeah.
The other thing that might simply be a practical thing is when you're doing something like Time Warp, you might be adding vocals after the fact, like, oh, we really need to beef this up and make it sound like a little bigger, or like there's a larger ensemble singing it. And Meatloaf is in here anyway. Hey, Meatloaf, could you mind doing the chorus to Time Warp a little bit so we can fill out the soundtrack? I've done that when I've done like short films and there was musical. Yeah.
It doesn't explain, though. Especially if you listen on the soundtrack on Spotify, the instrumental version of Time Warp, why he's saying it's just a jump to the left very quietly in that channel. It's very weird. If you listen to it, if you guys listen to it, let me know what you think and what your opinions are. But So anyway, on top of what I give Eddie, as much as I love Meatloaf's little solo with the note and the fact that it's a song about Eddie and it's cute, one time listen, it doesn't do much for the sake of the actual soundtrack itself. The original cast version is better. Fun fact, Meatloaf actually played Dr. Scott and Eddie in the actual show.
From the day he was born, he was trouble.
I'm totally with you on here. I think it's a one-time listen. I do, generally speaking, like the song.
It's a good. Yeah,
It's okay. Like, there's nothing, terribly wrong with it, but it really doesn't make much of an impression on me. And especially in the context of the film, it doesn't work terribly well. And in the soundtrack, yeah, we're past Eddie. We've moved on. I don't really care right now.
You're cracking out some really weird trivia. I'd never heard that thing about these like hidden vocal tracks and stuff.
Listen to the song, you'll hear it.
Yeah, I've heard the song 1,000 times. It's just not something I've ever really paid that close attention to. I just really have nothing to add. I think this is just another one of those blandly functional songs. It's all been said at this point, and more so.
Yeah.
So yeah,
you give it.
I guess a one-time listen.
Yeah, it's not bad enough to skip.
Yeah, you're gonna have to skip it. You just don't have to listen to it either.
Yeah.
Yep, it is what it is. And we're going to go on to the next. The next song is actually I'm going to put them both together because they kind of go one right into the other. It's Planet, Scam It, Janet, Wise Up Janet Weiss, and Hot Dog.
I'll tell you twice. You better.
In the course of the movie, they pull back a tablecloth, and it turns out his dead body is underneath the table, so somehow they're getting the food from under the tablecloth? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Shouldn't he be in the kitchen? But yeah, we get to see this mutilated corpse. It looks nothing like Meatloaf. I saw the movie 2 or 3 times before I realized that was supposed to be Eddie.
Yeah.
That's a rather tender subject. Oh, it's a cannibalism joke. I'm a little dense. It took me a little while. But I think at that point, we really needed to lighten things up a little bit, so we're going to have this really fast, frantic chase. And all of a sudden, it's really active for like maybe a minute, and it's actually really welcome. And I think we get to hear Tim Curry singing again, and he gets to sort of be a little bit crueler now. He's, I tell you once, he tells Janet, your apple pie don't taste too nice. He starts mocking the heroes now, kind of really cementing the fact that he's a villain, but he's still Tim Curry, he's still Dr. Frankenfurter, so if he's going to sing a really threatening villain song, it's still going to be really upbeat. And I think it's really fun to listen to, and then when he's finally confronted, they sing You're a Hot Dog, which is more or less the same song. And I don't know what that insult means, actually. You're a hot dog? I know his name is Frankenfurter, and you're a hot dog, but so I get that connection.
Well,
I'm not totally thick, but I'm not sure.
Hold on. A Frankenfurter has a cachet. Frankenfurter could be a delicious cuisine. A hot dog is bullshit. A hot dog is just something you can get in the frozen food section in a microwave. A Frankenfurter, you have to make a Frankenfurter. A Frankenfurter is good eating. So I think that's what that means. But I'll be perfectly honest about these two songs. I forgot these songs existed until you mentioned that we need to do them on the show. I have very little memory of them. I've seen this movie multiple times. They're okay, I guess, but I gotta tell you, I think they're completely disposable. Yeah. I'm not in it. I'm not in this one. This is, I think this is, I mean, I wouldn't call any song in the Rocky Horror soundtrack a bad song, because none of them are. But these are the ones that just made no impression on me.
It's literally a skip it, because literally on the actual soundtrack, like Sword of Damocles, they're not on there.
I mean, yeah, initially people forget this, that, LPs and cassettes and 8-tracks and even CDs, there was only so much music you could put on them.
5 minutes.
Yeah. So, like, sometimes, if you didn't think it was going to be popular enough to warrant a double album, you had to make choices on what made it in and what didn't. And this might just be that simple, and it just got grandfathered in and nobody questioned it. Sometimes that happens where decisions are made long ago for practical reasons, and people forget that there was a practical reason for that, and there's no reason to follow it now. If you've ever seen the Beatles documentary, Let It Be, that was originally, if memory serves, in full frame, and then they decided to make it widescreen, and then when they decided to pan and scan it for television, they didn't just lift the bars and show you the full frame, they pan and scanned the widescreen. So you only saw, maybe 30% of the image. And there was literally no reason for it. And this might just be that simple, but with soundtracks. Just, we lost it for space. And then we just left it out of there because it was never in there.
Yeah, and I think it's just also because these songs just don't really serve that much of a purpose by themselves. So I would say actually skip it. I'm assuming Bibbs yours would be a skip it.
I'm also going to go with a skip it. Whitney?
I think it really serves an important role in terms of tone and in terms of pacing. I mean, William was just talking about how that dinner scene is death, and it is. It goes on and on and on. It has some of... When that scene comes on, the live cast, what are they going to do? Sit around a table and just sort of sit on stage for a while? At that point, they just started inviting people onto the stage, and they opened Twinkies, and they just started rolling around a little bit. And
yeah,
it's
fill the time.
Yeah, they just there's nothing to do, and the people start singing dirty sea chanties for no reason at that moment. It's just so boring, and I think. Maybe I'm just comparing it to all of the dullness that immediately came before, that we finally have this hit of energy to bring things back up just in time for the climax, rather than just sort of sleepwalking into it. It serves a very important tonal and pacing function. So, in the broader context of the soundtrack, I think it's definitely a listen to, at least once through. If you're looking for a single track to download to get sort of the gist of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you can skip this one.
Yeah, so it's definitely on the weaker echelon, indeed. So we're going to go on to what on the soundtrack. It's all the same song. It's one giant medley.
Yeah, Rose Tint My World.
It's called The Floor Show. Rose Tint My World. Don't dream it, be it. Wild and untamed thing. And I'm going home.
Recap. We get to finally see where everybody is in terms of the story. We get to figure out what this movie is a little bit about, if it's about anything. I think it is most definitely about something. I think it's sort of showing, the downfall of innocence and how, in a weird way, it's kind of mourning the loss of the very innocence it's mocking by showing how all of the characters have run into this old dark house run by this ostensibly horrendous villain, and how it's kind of consumed them and turned them into, for lack of a better term, drag queen slaves. And, how whether or not they're comfortable with that is something they get to sing about. And, everybody essentially starts singing in a rather upbeat fashion how horrible their lives have suddenly become. Except for Janet. Janet's the only one who seems on board with all of this. Here's William.
I really, really love this song. I think this whole bit is really important to the movie, and it's something that, frankly, I think more movies should have. Most movies, and indeed most stories, are stories of change. People who start out one way, and at the end of the story, they're another way. They've risen to a challenge, or they failed to meet that challenge, or they've discovered who they are. But with every change comes a loss. You lost to the person you were before. And this is the song that I think embraces that melancholy, where whether we are comfortable with who we are now and the sexual awakening that we have experienced, we still lost the people that we were, and the people that we were innocent and frankly likable. They were not bad people. They were naive and repressed in some cases, but they weren't bad. And although they may have grown, they may have flowered, the people that we met at the beginning of the film have been functionally destroyed. And I love that Rocky Horror is self-aware and earnest enough to be honest and frank, no pun intended, about that. And to say to the audience, listen, we love that everyone in the cast is now currently in garters and strutting around the stage, and we know that that's awesome and that the future is much gayer than the past, at least the recent past, and that we'll all be better off for it. But that doesn't mean that this hasn't come as quite a shock to all of these characters. And I love that. I love that the movie has mixed feelings about that and is able to sympathize with characters who have mixed feelings about that. So yeah, I think it's a great song. I think it is beautiful. I think it's a little haunting, and I think it's very daring to take a movie that was desperately trying for most of its running time to be very frothy and light, even when it was dark and horrifying, and actually confront the actual soul within it. So I love this whole bit. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, it goes from you kind of take what you know from the movie as the song by itself. You can tell what the characters are and what the motivations are just by the lyrics. And and by the end of it, they're all kind of with Frank, and they become happy for a very, very short period of time.
Well, it's the happiness that comes with decadence. The Palace of was it the path to access leads to the Palace of Wisdom or something like that. And I feel like this is them getting extremely out of control at a party. And having maybe the most incredible party of their entire lives, and then afterwards, they might never speak of it again. And I think the movie is pretty blunt about that.
What was your score?
Oh, download it. I think they're fundamentally a huge part of what Rocky Horror is. It's maybe not as catchy, or as silly, or even as funny as many of the other songs that are really, really popular. But I think if you only take songs like Touch It, Touch Me, or The Time Warp, or Damn It, Janet, out of Rocky Horror, then I think you're missing the soul of Rocky Horror. And I think this song right here is where that soul is completely laid bare. And so I think it's really important to make this part of your Rocky Horror diet.
Yeah. Whitney, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, this, even though like the Time Warp and Sweet Transvestite are kind of the heart and soul of Rocky Horror, this is the one that has everything in it. It has, a good modulation, has good different kinds of songs. There's Rose to My World 1 is really kind of rocking. Rose to My World 2 is really kind of melancholy, has a lot more film references. When you're watching it on the big screen, this is where the RKO logo shows up. And then it goes back into rocking again, and everybody does this big kick line, and you know, Dr. Scott has also been sort of assimilated into the drag, and everybody's just having a wonderful time saying, "Rose tint my world," and of course, and this is also where they're saying, "Don't dream it, be it," and this is how it's calling and celebrating. Calling for and celebrating a certain kind of delicious sexual hedonism, especially in the face of all of that 50s repression that this film is satirizing. But at the same time, it is saying that there is kind of a legitimate wickedness there. And I'm not sure the film is, because of the way it's directed, if it's trying to use that sort of depiction of hedonism as a wicked act as an extension of its satire of like 50s scare films, or if it actually has a little bit of a judgmental streak.
Sweet. And your rating?
Just call it out.
Download it.
Download
really
it.
good, yeah.
For me, it's the heart of the musical. I actually think it's rocking. I especially love the portion, I'm Going Home, where basically Frank just wears his heart on his sleeve. And then we transition into Superhero.
Whitney talks about how the film ultimately, at least in terms of how it plays out chronologically, sides against Frank. It says that Frank was indeed, although he represents in many respects aspirational openness about his sexuality, Frank is evil. And I think the ending of his journey is melancholy. His subordinates betray him. And Riff Raff and Magenta ultimately say that he has gone too far. And I think that's something that Whitney talked about, how, you know, surely the film's attitude and moral and theme is about sort of embracing the film's wild lifestyles. But I think it also argues in the end that it can go too far, that there is a downside. And it's one thing to you know, be open with your sexuality, to sleep with everybody, and another thing to kill people, and another thing to play God, and to corrupt and destroy simply because you can. So
Marquis de Sade thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's a Marquis de Sade thing. So yeah, I think this is it on some level. The song kind of only exists to wrap up the movie, and it does that. But I think it really puts a button on the film's morality, which is that morality is extremely flexible, but even Rocky Horror has limits. And I think that's where it's not really a scare film, because it's not saying that everything outre is bad, everything new or strange is bad. That's the hallmark of a quote-unquote classic scare film. Reefer is always bad, says Reefer Madness. This is, no. Sexuality is great, and dressing up is great, and being gay is great. Just, you probably shouldn't kill people. That's really quite bad, and eventually it will come back around and haunt you. You're not immune from any sort of consequence. So I think it's odd, because after this, you know, it kind of leaves everybody in a pile of their own regret, and it's a weird melancholy beat. To leave this film, which is considered so light and fun and midnight movie crazy, but it works. And I think it fits the film, and I think it fits its themes. So yeah, I'm going to give this one. Purely as a soundtrack, I'm going to give it a one-time listen, because it's kind of just wrapping up the plot. But when it comes to its context within the movie, it's really important.
I'll go for Whitney.
It's superheroes.
Yeah.
Superheroes, I think it does more than just wrap it up. I think it really does go out on this incredibly downbeat note about how all of the characters have been horrendously injured. They haven't just sort of like enjoyed sort of exploring their sexuality. By the end of the movie, they've tasted human flesh, quite literally. Yeah. And the lyrics are really sad. Brad's final lyric that he sings, he's sort of, and you know, in the context of the movie, is just sort of wailing up at the sky. He's injured, he can barely even walk. Just says, "All I know is inside I'm bleeding." And then they cut over to Janet, who's also crawling through the muck, and the last thing she says is, "All I know is still the beast is feeding." Like, things are kind of rotten inside of them now. And then we finally cut over to the criminologist, and he gives us sort of a little miniature coda to the whole thing, and I can recite the whole thing. It says, "In crawling on the planet's face, some insects called the human race, lost in time and lost in space and meaning." Just this is completely, and then the chorus.
It sounds like a Poe poem.
Yeah, it's this unbelievably bleak, downbeat ending for a film that just an hour ago was about how great it was to be a transvestite. And Jim Sharman and again, this is something I'm really kind of ambivalent about Rocky Horror, even having seen it as many times as I have. I'm still unsure as to how much we're supposed to read that as satire, and how much we're supposed to really buy into how painful it feels. It's a little too authentically painful to leave the theater singing and dancing.
Well, can I talk about that?
Yeah, sure, that's all right.
Because I think we have this tendency to want our fun, frivolous, escapist things to stay fun, frivolous, and escapist, and we want our serious, soulful things to stay serious and soulful. And many of my favorite things are both, or at the very least can achieve both at their crescendos. With Rocky Horror, it started off as farce. It started off as riffing on old ideas, and I think the idea that the movie had, whether or not each individual audience member actually takes this away, is, an individual journey, and you could say it's the movie's fault or success if it works, but I think by the end we do care about these people to some extent, some more than others. Obviously, Columbia's life is full of tragedy. Obviously, Brad and Janet had their whole story of their entire lives hijacked, for better or worse, and destroyed over the course of one night. And I think the movie thought that by the end of this, we would actually care. Personally, I do. I think in some respects the ending is kind of triumphant. Sexual awakening and a lack of repression have won at some consequence, but in the end, won. And I think from a larger social perspective, that's a good thing. But again, I love that there is a sort of moral complexity to Rocky Horror that argues that although, we've moved on, we've come out the other side of the time warp, there's a real downside, and a lot of people who actually went through the change, they weren't born after society changed, they were there at the exact moment when it did, and they changed with it, and they made a lot of mistakes along the way, and they were did things that they liked, and they did things that they're not proud of. I think it's about that. I think it's about that story. I think it's about that transitional period. It's not just about, the old times were dumb and the new times were better. I think it's about the bit in the middle where they met. And, as a result, I think the ending really works. And even though it is melancholy, I think it earned it. But I also understand that if you're really into the frothy first half of the movie, it can feel almost a little bit like a betrayal.
Yeah, as the penultimate song, I feel like it really kind of encompasses the actual emotion that was pent up throughout the entire, not just from the movie itself, just from the soundtrack and what everybody's going through. Superheroes kind of envelops that. And you know what's actually weird is that Superheroes is actually cut from the US version of the film. So it literally goes from the floor show to what we're going to get into, the reprise of science fiction double feature. So you don't even get that closure with those characters in that moment in the US version, which I think this song is necessary to fill that gap.
I'm going to make another reference to John Waters. He made a film called Multiple Maniacs. It's really, really wonderful. And at the end of that movie, the divine character is essentially becomes Godzilla and is shot down by the military, more or less. And there is this sort of tradition throughout a lot of cinema history to vilify and sacrifice and essentially martyr the gay characters. The queer characters were often depicted as being sort of monstrous when they're the villain characters of the piece, And, you look at going all the way back to Frankenstein and even before, there's this tradition of hunting down and murdering the monster that kind of leaked into cliche.
Well, and even,
I think...
let me just hop in real fast to support that point. And even later on, when they were those characters were portrayed more sympathetically, like Sal Mineo and Rebel Without a Cause, look what happened.
Yeah, it's their... Yeah, these queer-coded characters were always doomed. They were always set to be killed from the start. And I think Richard O'Brien is trying to maybe play into that a little bit, that it wouldn't feel like an appropriate film. It wouldn't feel like an ending. It wouldn't read as the type of film it is unless they played into that cliche, where Frankenfurter, the gay character, yeah, he's a villain, but we like him. He's a horrible cannibal, but we still dig Frankenfurter. Everybody wants to dress as Frankenfurter.
We wish we had his confidence.
Yeah, I don't want to be a cannibal, but I want to be as confident as he is. I feel like the Rocky Horror Picture Show is trying to retell that type of story, or at least that aspect of that type of story with its ending, where we do reveal that Frank is a horrendous villain, and as such, just like Margaret Hamilton at the end of The Wizard of Oz, needs to be taken out. That's just the dictate of the story. If he got away with it, that wouldn't be a satisfying ending, and I think the film might be mourning that a little bit. I think the film even though Frank is a villain, and Frank does need to be taken out, and he's broken all of the laws of even his own planet, I think the film also understands that he's really the hero of the piece. And the superheroes that they're singing of are the people who have essentially fallen and essentially fucked everything up for the gay characters. If you look at it in a certain way, even though it's a really kind of melancholy ending, it's really a little bit more of a revenge. And that's a possible way to read it.
Real fast, because Whitney convinced me I'm changing my vote. This is totally a download it. He totally changed my perspective on the song. I think he nailed it. This is a download it.
It's an easy download it for me. Whitney, what do you actually consider it?
Yeah, what's your rating?
On superheroes, I feel like this is a download just because it was missing from the film for so long. It has sort of a rarefied air to it, sort of like once in a while.
What was missing? It's the perfect epilogue.
It's the perfect epilogue. I feel like it doesn't just cut to the reprise. It actually has that last spoken bit by the criminologist.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, that little poem that he speaks, which gets it in there. I guess they felt it was a pacing issue. I couldn't say. Maybe it was one of those things where they could get all the rights to the songs but one. I couldn't say. But yeah, I'd say it's a download just because it has a reputation in my brain. But also, yeah, I think it does have a lot of bleak darkness that really underscores a lot of what the Rocky Horror Picture Show might be.
So we're going to go right into what it actually goes into, which is essentially a reprise of science fiction double feature.
Science fiction.
I have to admit, this is the song from the Rocky Horror Picture Show I am the least familiar with, and that includes the one that's not in the movie. Because whenever we'd show this film live, the projectionist was instructed to cut the sound out so the cast could play their own music. This is... It's way too... Yeah, they play the credits over their own boombox. And it's way... I mean, the ending is really downbeat. It's really kind of depressing, even when you're being sort of raucous. By the time you get to this point, it's 3 in the fucking morning. You want to go home. You either you scored in the back row or you didn't, and you need to go. And so, the last thing you want to hear is a tinkling little music box score about how darkness has consumed Brad and Janet. What you want to hear is somebody playing, Bicycle Race by Queen while the cast makes their curtain calls. So, as such, I've come to learn that this song is disposable completely and can be chopped off of the soundtrack without losing anything.
I'm going to have a counterpoint to that.
All right.
I have a counterpoint to that. Whitney is talking about the motion picture experience.
Yeah.
Motion picture experience, especially with Rocky Horror, is different than motion picture experience you're going to get with almost any other movie because it is almost exclusively screened with an interactive audience. So at that point, the playing of a different song, or the cutting of this song from the end of the movie, is playing to the crowd. If you're just listening to the soundtrack, the reprise of the lullaby closes out the story. And I think it actually works as a soundtrack even better than it does in the film. So I'm going to say this is a listen to it once. You know, you don't really need to make this part of your heavy rotation with Rocky Horror. But if you're just listening to the soundtrack, this is a good coda. This just wraps it all up. It's pretty short. It's a nice little reminder of the journey we've taken, and then we just move on.
Yeah, I would actually agree, Bibbs. I feel like this is necessary, at least for the soundtrack purpose, to kind of wrap things up. I would give it, because I really like the instrumentation, because I like the lullaby kind of thing. I would say download it. I like the arrangement of it, if that makes sense.
I'm probably not going to talk about it, but on the original soundtrack record, there was a remix of the Time Warp, where it's just sort of the extended dance floor remix. At least that's the version I had growing up. I had the old cassette of it, and that it actually did have all of the songs. It didn't have Once in a While, but it did have this really wonderful rockin' follow-up of the Time Warp, which is a good way to end the soundtrack, because presumably that's your favorite song. That's like the fun one. That's the big fun one, and like right in the middle of the song, it's the one that's on all the records. I imagine it was played in a lot of dance clubs back in the 1970s. I know Sweet Transvestite was remixed in like the 2010s at some point. Mm-hmm. As a whole package, I think the soundtrack is just pretty rockin' all the way through. We're going through song by song, saying you should download it. Well, hey, I'm old-fashioned. Go to a used CD store and just get the CD. You'll have them all. It's probably in the dollar bin. You'll save some money. I think it functions perfectly well as a complete unit, even though it kind of has a few highs and lows. And it's one of the records that I probably listen to more than any other, just through the circumstances of my life.
Excuse me 1 second.
Here's William.
What are your thoughts on the actual soundtrack itself?
First off, do not go to a record store right now. A, they won't be open, and B, if they are open, it's not safe. So stay inside, and if you absolutely must get the physical media, which I highly encourage, you can order that online. As for the whole soundtrack, the soundtrack rocks. The soundtrack is amazing. The soundtrack is beautiful. The soundtrack, I don't think it has any duds in it. There's a couple of songs that are a little disposable, and I don't necessarily need to hear them every single time. But they are all of a piece. They all connect thematically and musically. They are funny without just being stupid. They are thoughtful. They have a point. And I think the point of Rocky Horror is sometimes... I don't think it's forgotten, because I think it's so in your face, but I think it's taken for granted. And I personally love this movie unabashedly on its own merits, even though, of course, I can be critical of elements of it. And I think the soundtrack is a great introduction to the film, even if you haven't seen it. I would argue that it is at least as good as the soundtrack to Shock Treatment.
I think Shock Treatment is a better soundtrack.
We're going to get to that at some point. I'm going to say this right now. The sequel to Rocky Horror, people don't talk about very much. Shock Treatment, not as good a film, arguably a better soundtrack.
Which is the whole point of the show.
Exactly. So we'll talk about that some other day. But yeah, Rocky Horror rules.
Yeah, Rocky Horror is amazing. I think we all agree. Our final verdict of the entire soundtrack is rockin'. There's no other which way around it. Even if you go by our scores, our averages, most of the songs that we said are rockin' on average. Yeah. So it is a rockin' score Rocky Horror, fun from beginning to end. Before we do our sign-offs, there is one last section of the show called Cut It or Keep It, which is the deleted songs from the movie that were on Broadway. And there's only one. And that is Once in a While.
And that's all the time that it takes.
Once in a While is a ballad. It's a solo sung by Brad that he sings after Frankenfurter has seduced him, and it's actually the only ballad in the movie. Apart from like Superheroes, it's like the slow, mellow one. And I remember, when I was in high school and I was, ignorant little dickhead. I was. I didn't like what, like, Once in a While had sort of just come to light, like, on the 20th anniversary of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I was listening to it. It's like, yeah, if you're going to give me a new song, I want it to be another Sweet Transvestite. I want it to be another Time Warp. I want it to be something just as raucous and as fun that I can get outraged that it was cut from the piece. And when I heard that it was this sort of, like, tender one-person ballad, and I've seen footage of the film as well, you can see, like, the deleted scene, and it's more or less just shots of Brad sitting in bed smoking a cigarette. You know, there's not a lot of action or dynamic anything going on with Once in a While. And I can understand why they would cut it. It's pacing problems, mood problems, tone problems. They just can't really justify the fact that this song is in there. When it's on stage, you can do that sort of mood shifts a lot more easily because the actor's in the room with you. They can read the room. They can change the energy to their whim. With a film like this, which already has a lot of pacing problems, putting Once in a While back into it would have essentially been death. I can totally understand why they cut it, even though it's a fine enough song, and I think Barry Bostwick sings it quite well. William, do you know Once in a While?
No!
For Once in a While, it's basically meant to be the mirror or the coinciding mirror to Touch Me. You're supposed to get Janet's side of things and then Brad's side of things after we didn't really touch upon it, but that bedroom kind of rape scene is probably the most disturbing scenes in the entire film. But it's meant to be kind of their reaction to both of them. So before we sign off, Whitney, since you're on screen right now, what is your favorite song off the soundtrack? What do you consider your favorite?
I mean, I really have to fight not to say Sweet Transvestite. I guess I'll say Hot Patootie. I'll be a little bit more contrarian, run out to the edge there a little bit. I think Hot Patootie is really just sort of maybe the one song on the soundtrack that can play as sort of a good rock hit without any sort of film context whatsoever. You could hear the song as just sort of some sort of really raucous 1950s biker tune. You could say, oh, this was like a failed Beach Boys project, and somebody, you might be able to fool someone with that one. So yeah, you know what? Right now, today, this evening, I'm going to say Hot Patootie.
And maybe tomorrow it'll be different.
Tomorrow it'll be different.
Where can the good people find you online?
I'm online. I am the co-host of several podcasts over on the critically acclaimed network with Mr. William Bibbiani. You can find our Patreon, patreon.com/critically acclaimed network, where you can find all of our podcasts sort of gathered under one banner. Well, we do have a Patreon, which means if you sign up at various tiers, you can hear more and more of our podcasts. We put out more or less a new podcast every day.
Just about.
We're almost on a daily schedule here, so we have no end of podcasts, including a Star Trek podcast, film review podcast, short-lived TV podcast, Firefly podcast, Best Picture podcast. What else do we got?
Star Wars.
Got a Star Wars podcast. So we got a little bit of everything. If you love the sound of my voice, good boy howdy, there's plenty to find it. You can find me on all the social medias. I have Twitter. I'm at Whitney Seibold. I have an Instagram. I'm at Whitney Seibold. Contact me any of those places and say hi and tell me how wrong I am about everything.
Well, I said it at the top. I think Science Fiction Double Feature is my favorite. I feel that Science Fiction Double Feature is kind of an anthem for anyone who likes cult movies. There's a lot of songs in the soundtrack that are funnier, that maybe have more soul, but none that speak to me the way that Science Fiction Double Feature does. So that's my personal favorite. Is it the best? No, that's Sweet Transvestite. It's my personal favorite? Yeah, it's Science Fiction Double Feature. Where can you find me? That's a great question.
He's right there.
If you can find me, you can hire the Bibbs team. No, I'm on Twitter at William Bibbiani. Together we're on Twitter at Critic Acclaim. Critically Acclaimed was too long for Twitter, so we had to go with Critic Acclaim. Well, there we go. But yeah, we have a whole bunch of podcasts. Critically Acclaimed Network is, a lot of our podcasts are free. Our Critically Acclaimed Movie Review podcast is free. Our We've Got Mail podcast is free, where we answer letters from folks who listen to our podcasts. Our new Star Wars podcast, Episode 0, where we don't talk about Star Wars, we talk about the movies that inspired Star Wars. That's brand new. That's also free. And Cancel Too Soon, where we review TV shows that lasted only one season or less. That is also free, and they're all in the Critically Acclaimed Network. And then, as Whitney said, patreon.com/critically acclaimed network. We have podcasts where we're reviewing every single episode of Star Trek, every single episode of Firefly, every film ever nominated for Best Picture. We have a new one called Not on Disney Plus, where we talk about Disney movies that have slipped through the cracks of history, and Disney isn't even putting them on Disney Plus. So we just did like all 3 of the Parent Trap sequels that are completely forgotten, 2 of which star Barry Bostwick. So, yeah, that's where you can find me. I also sometimes write for Bloody Disgusting.
Also, you can make sure to join the Facebook group of the Critically Acclaimed Podcast to interact with them if you can. The link will also be in the description for that down below. My personal favorite song is probably not a surprise. It's Hot Patootie. The Meatloaf song is a jam. What I think I would consider the best song off the record, I honestly, it might surprise you guys, but I think it's Floor Show. I think it encompasses everything about the movie into a 7-minute package. You go from Rose Check My Will to I'm Going Home, where Frank is basically putting his heart on his sleeve. So for me, you can also, you know me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at ChrisClark8788. Those numbers mean nothing. Make sure to check out our Streamlabs. Any donation, if you enjoyed our show, would be much appreciated. You guys are rock stars. Be sure to check out tomorrow night, the watch-along at 10 p.m. EST, 7 p.m. PST, and Saturday night's family game night, same time. And be sure to check out Evan DeGraff's show, Famous Last Words, with their guest this week. And be sure to check out next week's episode of Suddenly Soundtracks, the soundtrack that won the Disney List Countdown, Mary Poppins, with my guests, Rachel Silvestrini and Evan DeGraff. From Whitney, from Bibbs, from myself, thank you guys so much, and keep rocking.